Allora, la prossima presentazione adesso è veramente di Xiaoqiu, che è stata vincitrice della borsa della Fondazione Isaki Samaya e che presenta la sua ricerca dal titolo Cardiovascular Health Condition in Chinese Immigrants Living in Milan, e I guess the presentation is going to be in English.
Well, my name is Liu, and I won this scholarship when I was in the last year of my PhD program in Milan, University of Milano-Bicocca, under the supervision of Professor Gianfranco Parati. We had the idea to investigate the cardiovascular health condition in Chinese immigrants living in Milan, probably because a simple fact that there's a huge Chinese population living in Italy. According to the National Institute of Statistics data from 2015, there were more than 300,000 Chinese living in Italy. That means among every 200 people living in Italy, there's one Chinese. And most of them come from Zhejiang province in South China. However, we don't know anything about their health condition. And we know that probably health condition of a person or of a population can be affected by the healthcare accessibility in the host country, in this case Italy, or the acceptance of the host society to the immigrants, or the diet of the host country, also the diet or lifestyle that they take with them from the original country. So with this question mark, we decided to conduct 2 pilot studies to investigate the cardiovascular profile in Chinese immigrants living in Milan, and compared with, first of all, the local Italians, and second, with Chinese living in Beijing. Taking advantage of the data from the World Hypertension Day, which is May 15, the Policlinico in Milan conducts healthcare activity in the Chinese community in Milan via Paolo Sapi. Every year they will administer questionnaires on the cardiovascular data, variables, and the BP will be measured on site. And meanwhile, there's also a parallel survey conducted in the whole Italy with very similar questions, variables in the cardiovascular variables. So we take advantage of those data, selected 487 Chinese living in Milan, investigated in the Hypertension Day 2030 and 2015. Those subjects were matched with the Italians from the North Italy investigated in the Hypertension Day 2015 with data with the age and the gender matched. Overall, we have the subjects age around 48 years old, and the Chinese subjects, most of the Chinese subjects that we investigated had lived in Italy for more than 10 years. And overall, the Chinese subjects had a smaller body mass index, which means they were thinner than the Italian subjects. And our interest is particularly on the blood pressure and the hypertension prevalence and control. You can see here that among all the investigated 487 subjects, Chinese subjects, almost about 67% of them were hypertensive. And among the hypertensive subjects, less than 70 were treated. Among the treated subjects, less than half were had their BP under control, which means below 140 and 90. Which means that the only 34%, less than 34% of the hypertensive subjects had their BP controlled. And this data is worse in the Italians. However, considering that the hypertension prevalence were much less than the in the population, well, the population with the sample, only 38, which is like half the prevalence of that in the Chinese subjects. You can also see that the absolute numbers of the BP, systolic and diastolic BP in the Chinese subjects were 132, 84, while these values in the Italian subject were much less. Another thing that I'm very interested in is the smoking rate. You can see from the first part that the smoking rate seemed to be very similar between the Chinese subjects and Italians. However, if we look closer, you find that there's a gender difference. Look at only the males, that Chinese subjects had a much higher smoking rate. And there's another story in the females, however, that the smoking rate in the Chinese subjects were much less. And this reflects exactly the different phase of smoking pattern progress. China is in the second phase too, which means there you can find more male smokers and very little or less, much less smoking rate in females. And Italy was in this phase too, like in 1950s, 70s. However, as time goes by, you can see that the smoking rate in males start to drop and the smoking rate in females arises. At a certain point, the smoking rate between females and males become closer, and which is the last phase. That's the situation where Italy is right now. So from the pilot study 1, we see that the Chinese immigrants are not in a very healthy condition, and they are much higher and much more hypertension cases and more smoking, although they are in general a lot thinner than the Italians. The second pilot study involves the subjects selected from those who visited the hospital for general physical check, and this study has 2 arms. The first arm is Chinese living in Milan, who had lived in Milan for more than 12 months, who visited the polyclinic for health check in 2014 to 2017. And the other arm is Chinese living in Beijing, who had a residence in Beijing and visited the Fuwai Hospital for also the general health check. Again, the subjects were matched by age and gender. Variables are collected also for the blood test and the blood pressure. Overall, we have 269 pairs, and the subjects in Milan here. Subjects in Milan had smaller body mass index, means they are thinner than subjects in Beijing. And again, most of the subjects in Milan had lived in Italy for more than 10 years. Again, the blood pressure, you see that both the systolic and the diastolic blood pressure were less in the subjects living in Milan as compared with those living in Beijing. And this difference is merely seen in females. You can also see that the hypertension prevalence were much lower in Milan subjects, which was about less than 50%, while this prevalence were about 55%. Regarding the blood sugar level, we see the same pattern probably. The glucose level were much higher in the Beijing subjects as compared with those living in Milan. And the diabetic prevalence were more than 50% in subjects living in Beijing, which is very high. And the prevalence of diabetes in subjects living in Milan were about 27%, a little bit better, but not very good. So from pilot study 2, we see that the Chinese immigrants are probably in a better condition than those living in Beijing, and the BP level were lower, the hypertension prevalence were lower, the glucose level were lower, and the diabetes prevalence were lower. However, we need to notice that not all the studies on the immigrants had the same conclusion. A meta-analysis including 16 studies on the first generation, mainly living in USA, in Canada, and the UK. They found that compared with the Chinese living in mainland, the first generation of Chinese living abroad had increased prevalence of diabetes, hypertension, obesity, and smoking. Well, there are many reasons that could cause this difference. For example, the diet. It's well known that the Mediterranean diet is much healthier than the fried food, for example. However, we have also to admit that our pilot studies are limited. First of all, the limitation one, the sample selection. There's a study conducted in Zhejiang province where the majority of the Chinese immigrants come from. This study was conducted in the subjects, adult subjects, and they found that the hypertension prevalence and the diabetes prevalence were much lower, around 15%, 16%. While in our study, we found that the hypertension prevalence were much higher. Apart from all the factors that could increase the cardiovascular risk following the fact that they are immigrated to another country, we also need to admit that our subject selection cannot represent the general population. Considering that they visited the hospital for the physical check, we can speculate that there's already some reason pushed them into this decision to get the physical check. So we can, these numbers that the higher prevalence of hypertension and diabetes is expected. The limitation 2 is also about the sample selection. You can see that 2 different studies conducted in Zhejiang province, South China, and another one conducted in Beijing. The hypertension and diabetes prevalence were very different. This is obviously caused by the geographic difference as one of the main reasons. Same thing that you can also see from the Italian population, maybe that the north and the south, they have very different conditions. And so in the comparison between the Chinese immigrants that come from south with the Chinese living in Beijing is not very fair. But however, due to the limitation of the data source and so on, that's our best choice probably. So our data provide some profile into the cardiovascular system diseases of the Chinese immigrants living in Milan. On one hand, we are happy that there are some data can tell us something about them. But on the other hand, we know that there's a great need for a better study, a better, well-designed study to really investigate the cardiovascular system or the general health condition in the immigrants, not only the Chinese immigrants, but all the immigrants that living abroad and so on. So there's a Belt and Road project led by the Chinese government involving also political is pending, and I do hope that the protocol can be finalized and soon be conducted. Last, thank my deep appreciation for the Fondazione Isaac Samir and Fondazione Roberto Franceschi for their very generous support. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much. We have time for some questions, if there is any. I have one question. So I was wondering whether you didn't think of also asking to Chinese in Italy where they were originally from, so that you could at least condition, I mean, you could compare those from Beijing with those from Beijing and so on.
Well, this question was not asked during the questionnaire. However, we more or less know that most of the Chinese immigrants living in Milan, they come from a small town in Zhejiang province in South China.
So why then you decided to do the survey in China in Beijing if you know most of the Chinese in Milan come from this small town in South China?
Well, yes, we recognize that limitation. This is indeed a big problem if we have to give a very, if we want to get a clear clue of the health condition. However, again, as we were very limited by the connections. For example, my professor had more connections in China from Beijing or Shanghai. But also the selection of data is not very easy. Only we contacted 2 hospitals in Shanghai and 2 hospitals in Beijing, and only one agreed to have this cooperation with us, also because we don't have money in this case, yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, so thank you very much then.
Thank you.